Hello, my name is Tuğba Tanyeli Erdemir, and I am the coordinator of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Today, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar commemorating the day to mark the departure or expulsion of Jews from the Arab lands and Iran, organized by ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. We will start our programming with a 5-minute short film by Unpacked, a YouTube channel, titled What Happened to Mizrahi Jews of Arab Countries, outlining the history of Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
In the 2nd century CE, Roman occupiers crushed the last hint of Jewish rebellion in the region. The subsequent Jewish exile lasted nearly 2,000 years, creating a far-flung Jewish diaspora. The Jews who made their way to Southwest Asia and North Africa became known as Mizrahim, Easterners. For centuries, these Middle Eastern and North African Jews lived and worked, prospered or suffered as guests in foreign countries, their fortunes linked to the whims of often unfriendly rulers. Like Jews around the world, Mizrahi Jews dreamed of returning to their ancestral homeland, directing their daily prayers toward Jerusalem. This dream became an urgent necessity as the Second World War inched closer to their borders. By 1941, the Nazi ideology that had consumed Europe made its way to the Middle East, violently. After a failed coup attempt, Iraqi fascists took their displeasure out on the country's Jews, murdering, maiming, raping, and looting in a rampage of violence known as the Farhud, Arabic for violent dispossession. Under the collaborationist Vichy government, North African Jews were stripped of their citizenship. Thousands were then deported to forced labor camps where they were horribly abused. By 1945, Europe was a smoldering ruin with its Jewish communities hollowed out. As shell-shocked refugees trickled into Palestine, the UN prepared to vote on a plan that would carve out 2 separate states, one for Jews and one for Arabs, from the tiny sliver of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. In response, Muslim countries from Egypt to Iraq vowed that if Israel came into existence, the region's Jews would suffer horribly. A New York Times headline from May 1948 summarized the situation aptly. Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands, 900,000 in Africa and Asia face wrath of their foes. But Mizrahi Jews had a safe haven. True, their destination was a tiny, desperately poor country embroiled in a war against 6 much larger nations. And yes, it was bursting at the seams with refugees and survivors from all over the world. But it was also a place toward which Jews had directed 2,000 years' worth of prayers. And it was, and remains, the only country in the world that provides Jews with refuge, no questions asked. All told, nearly 600,000 Mizrahi Jews streamed into Israel between 1948 and 1972. Most were destitute, their property seized by the governments of their former homes. The total value of the assets stolen from Mizrahi Jews by Muslim governments is estimated to be worth $6.7 billion in today's dollars. But Mizrahi Jews who emigrated to Israel brought with them a different kind of wealth, that of a rich culture. They spoke Arabic, marked auspicious occasions with henna ceremonies, and read the Torah with lilting inflections. Uncomfortably for the Ashkenazi establishment, Mizrahi Jews bore a deep cultural resemblance to the country's highly unfriendly neighbors. Plus, many of the die-hard secularists in the government disdained the piety of the recent immigrants, who clung tenaciously to their religious traditions. Today, Mizrahi culture is almost synonymous with Israel. Turn on the radio, and you'll likely hear the silsulim and ma'awalim of traditional Mizrahi music transposed onto modern pop. Ask any Israeli about an iconic Israeli food, and they'll tell you malawach, not matzo balls. You'd be hard-pressed to find a Jewish Israeli of any background who hasn't attended a mimuna or a henna. Most notably, as of 2016, 20% of Israelis are half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi. The country's European founders might not have imagined their country with over 50% Mizrahi. They may not have predicted Mizrahi politicians in the Knesset, mixed ethnicity families in every other house, or Mizrahi entertainers at the top of the charts. But in the words of writer Matzi Friedman, that we are free, safe from persecution, and in charge of ourselves, these things are new. But that we are here, in the Middle East, There is nothing new about that at all.
Thank you to all of you joining us today for this timely and critical webinar. I'm Marjan Kapoor Greenblatt, and I'm the co-chair of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Since its establishment in 1913, ADL has been a strong voice with the mission of stopping the defamation of Jewish people and securing fair and just treatment for all. Following our founding vision, ADL launched its first ever task force on Middle East minorities 5 years ago in 2018, with a mission of educating, advocating, and elevating the issues challenging these important and all too often overlooked communities across the Middle East, including religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, as well as other groups who face governmental and societal repression, as well as discrimination. Today, we commemorate the day to mark the departure or expulsion of Jews from the Arab lands and Iran. And in this panel that is hosted by ADL's task force, we will discuss some important topics, and one that is very personal to me. As an Iranian Jew, my family and my community was forced to leave their homeland of millennia since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And I know that this will resonate with many of you as well. In the mid-20th century, about 900,000 Jews from across the Muslim world, known as the Mizrahim, were expelled, fled, or left their homes behind. They left behind their families that they dwelt in for centuries and even millennia. And this was not an easy decision. By confronting anti-Semitism and pogroms, many fled, leaving everything they had left behind. For those, there were no choice. They were forced to leave. These Jews fled to countries such as France, Mexico, and the United States, with large numbers settling in Israel. The Jewish population of Israel today is over 50% Mizrahi and Sephardi, and includes the descendants of this mass expulsion from Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, and Yemen. The Jewish expulsion from the Muslim world is commemorated on November 30th. And today, to have a discussion on this topic, there are three panelists who will share their personal stories and families' histories with us. It's my pleasure to introduce them. Shadi Martini is the Chief Executive Officer of the Multi-Faith Alliance and is a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Carol Nouriel is ADL's Senior Regional Director for Israel, Middle East, and North Africa. And Sharon Nazarian is the President of YNS Family Foundation and founder and former co-chair of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. She is also a member of ADL's Board of Directors. And finally, to lead us in this discussion, our moderator will be George Salim, ADL's Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President of Public Affairs. And he is also my co-chair at the task force, and it will be my pleasure to pass the baton to him.
Excellent. Thank you, Marjan. Thank you so much for your welcome and for your scene setting. And I'd like to jump right into the discussion today. And Sharon, I'd like to ask you to help kick us off. So for background, you personally have firsthand experience as being an exiled from your homeland and from your place of birth. To start the conversation today, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own personal story. What were the conditions that made it impossible for your family to continue living in Iran and seek a new homeland? And moreover, how did this process change you as a young person into ultimately the career and professional life that you've chosen later on?
Thank you, George, and thank you, Marjan, for that wonderful opening remarks. This is a very personal day for all of us on this panel. And for me, just to set the stage, my father, who was born in 1931 in Tehran, was born in a legal ghetto. So in 1931, Jews of Iran, having existed as a community in Iran for over 2,700 years, were still living the life of second-class citizens, of dhimmis, or inferior minority. The arc of my father's life and so many other Jews represented what happened in the next decades under the king of Iran. And so my father went from being a poor child in a ghetto to a prominent businessman by the 1970s, one that felt he had on one hand the protection of minority status by the government, and yet still not privy to the best positions, to government contracts. He later on went on to become a manufacturer, and he imported road construction machinery. And I think the first day he got a government contract as a Jewish Iranian, it was a historic day. So his life represented what the community was able to achieve in a matter of decades until the revolution. Now, I do want to say that even as a child, I was 10 in 1979 when the revolution happened. In our home, the lives of Jews in Iran inside the house was a very different one than the one in public. We had code switching. We had language that we spoke at home. Words were permitted to use. And for those of you who know that, the Judeo-ethnic dialects of communities from all over Iran, they had unique dialects from Esfahan to Shiraz to Tehran. Those dialects at home were a mix of Hebrew and Farsi, and were specific also to their own cities, language that was immersed from Esfahan and Shiraz. Those languages were only used in the house. And when we were out in public, not only our language, but our demeanor, the way we engaged with Muslim public was very different. So I remember growing up with memories from my father of daily attacks as a child by Muslim majority neighbors. And then in terms of his education, in terms of his first job offers. And so he was unique in that he did go to Israel after 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, got some skills, and then came back to Iran. But I would say that overall, most of our lives was very reminiscent of a lot of the checkered up and down history of Jews of Iran, which were their periods of tolerance and periods of deep discrimination, of not being able to go out in the street when it rained because Jews were considered impure or najis, of periods where they couldn't live in parts of town, of periods even before that where they had to wear specific clothing that distinguished them and that other public members would know that they're Jewish. So it's been a checkered history, and up until 1978, I would say it had been a period of real tolerance and growth and flourishing for the Jewish community. So I will stop there and allow others to give their stories as well. George, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Sharon, so much for helping set the scene with that. Carol, I'd like to turn to you now for a similar question in terms of setting the scene here. Personally, your family left Morocco, a land that they'd been living in for generations. So how was it growing up as a second generation immigrant, if you will? What was it like growing up in a way uprooted? And how did you and your family ultimately find a new home and a new life to flourish in? Can you share any specific memories or stories that your family may have passed on to you in a way that will be relevant for this topic today?
Thank you, George. And first of all, it's an honor to be here. And thank you all for the opportunity to share my personal story. Although my story starts when I was born in 1974, my journey really starts way before with both of my parents who were born in Rabat, Morocco's capital. My father's family was originally from a small city near Rabat, which is called Saleh. And Saleh had one of the biggest Jewish communities in Morocco with leading rabbis in Moroccan Jewish history that came from Saleh. The Jewish community in Morocco was actually the biggest Jewish community in the Arab world, dating back to the 2nd century, 600 years before Morocco adopted Islam. And after the Inquisition, a lot of Jews immigrated from Spain to Morocco and played prominent roles in the Moroccan kingdom. And this is how it is today. Today in Morocco, the senior advisor to the king is a Jew, and he's the most prominent Jew in the Arab world so far, and I would say holding the most prominent position of Jews worldwide. So I think it is fair to say that while we differentiate the Jewish community in Morocco from Muslim or Berber Moroccans, at least until many Moroccan Jews left to Israel, they saw themselves as an inherent part of the Moroccan society and not as a separate group. And that notion dictated a lot of emotions that have been part of leaving their beloved country. They were really part of society. And my father's family lived in Rabat. When I grew up, I heard these beautiful stories. And honestly, in my, when I got older, I thought that this was a sort of idealization of what they had. But when I went back with my parents and my siblings recently to Morocco, I understood that this is how they really experienced reality. So first they had wonderful relationship with the general society, meaning the Moroccan, the Muslims and the Berbers. Their lives were intertwined with those of the Muslims and Berbers to the tiniest detail. They worked together, they spent time as friends together, they studied together, they were even celebrating each other's holidays with so much respect to each other's culture. So really, they lived together in a very, very synced way. And the same was with my mother's family. They left Morocco when my mother was 7, but they had a similar experience in Rabat. Now, it's important to mention that Rabat's life was very different from the life of Jews in other smaller communities in Morocco. And with that notion of living together, they came to Israel. My father and my mother came to Israel after 67, after the 6-Day War, and before 74, before what Israel considered as the big defeat. And when they came to Israel and they encountered the conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, they didn't know what to do with it. They just didn't know what this notion of not getting along with your neighbors mean. So for us, being uprooted, I would say, meant a couple of things. First of all, living in a different culture. First and foremost, politically, living in a culture where there's a conflict, not where people live together. And also socially, having this constant dilemma between being a proud Israeli and being a proud Moroccan. And this is at a time when being Israeli was a status symbol in Israel. Everybody wanted to be the Israeli. And being Moroccan was not so much of a status symbol as North African Jews, and more generally Jews who came from Arab countries, were mostly considered in Israel as a lower socioeconomic class, and that dictated a lot of the treatment and the social relationship that has emerged in Israel following the waves of immigration from Arab countries. But that, I would say, has changed in the last 20 years, but I'll leave this story for the next question.
Perfect. Thank you for that setup, Carol. And before turning to Shadi, I want to just go back to both, Carol, your story and Sharon's story. And I want to spend just another few minutes talking about how this uprooting, if you will, if that's the right term to use, has really shaped your experience in a way that you can reflect on today. Like, what is the difference in your world perspective today as a result of this transition from birthland or homeland through the personal and professional experiences that you've both had? Sharon, maybe we'll start with you and then we'll go to Carol.
It has impacted me tremendously in everything I have done. I am essentially a double hyphenated identity. I'm a Jewish Iranian American, and they go hand in hand. I can tell you that from my selection of study of political science in college to teaching about the politics of the Middle East, to establishment of our family foundation with both activity and for work here in the US, but also having an arm of our foundation in Israel, but informed by our Iranian identity. And then probably the most pivotal work was when I've done what I did at ADL, and knowing that as an Iranian, when I was tapped for the position of Senior Vice President for International Affairs, the fact that I came from a vulnerable community, the fact that I understood what it meant to be a vulnerable Jew, really gave me a lens and gave me empathy and gave me understanding to represent ADL's work around the world. When I went to Europe or when I went to Latin America, I could speak to those communities in a way that really showed them I understood the insecurity they felt. I understood the concerns that they had when the government wasn't showing up for them. So, I mean, I can tell you one of the most pivotal moments was when, the Obama administration was trying to decide on the JCPOA, on the nuclear deal. And I felt that all three sides of me, and if you remember, Benjamin Netanyahu was very much against the deal. And so all three sides of me were like at war with each other. America was unhappy with Israel. Israel was unhappy with Iran, and it was such a moment of all my identities clashing with one another. As an Iranian American, I can tell you, I've tried to bring that understanding to every space I go into, whether it's with our administration. And I remember the Obama administration gathered many Iranian American leaders at the White House to start talking to us about JCPOA. And I thought it was very important because we have an understanding, especially as minority groups, of what the Islamic Republic of Iran is capable of. Is it trustworthy? Is it one that can be relied upon to negotiate, something as important as nuclear capabilities? So in every way, my Iranianness and my Jewishness impact what I do day in and day out. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of pride. So today, for example, in Los Angeles, where I live, many of the greatest musicians who have kept the authentic traditional music of Iran are Jews. In Iran, it was the same case. So there's so much of our culture that is alive in our homes, even in the diaspora. Our families, our children, they're understanding not only of Farsi language, but of the cuisine and of the music and of the stories. Like Carol, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of, it's in our soul, our Iranianness. At the same time, what the regime has done since 1979, not only of its own oppression of its own people, of its own minorities, including the Jewish community, but what it's done throughout the region as the #1 supporter of terrorism, as the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, of expanding its machine of terror throughout Latin America and Africa. So these are really moments of kind of, on one hand, pride about who we are, and on the other hand, really living in a country where one of the largest enemies of our new homeland, United States, is the regime of Iran, where we came from. And I'll share with you a last memory. When I came to America, I was in 7th grade, is when the Iran hostage crisis took place. So you can imagine being a young child, just, coming to America, sitting in the middle of a public school. I've never, I knew a little bit of English, and we were blamed as Iranians for the hostage crisis. So these are some of the markings that we all carry with us. And the hostage crisis was very painful because we understood that regime, we understood their intention, and yet somehow we were also, made to feel responsible for what that regime was doing to Americans in Iran. So I would say there's nothing I do where my Iranian identity and my Jewish identity are not right front and center in my work.
Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. And Carol, over to you for any similar analogies of your Moroccan heritage and identity that's carried over into your professional life.
So I feel very much like Sharon, and when I heard Sharon, I could just replace the words Iranian American with Israeli Moroccan. And for me too, it touched upon every element of my life. I was personally very proud of being a Moroccan, but there was also a price in social positioning. I was many times the other. And on the other hand, and maybe it's not on the other hand, maybe it's on the same side. This experience of being the other really shaped me and gave me tools to be strong in my Moroccan identity, which was not easy in Israel when I was born. And when I grew up, also to strengthen and empower others in their identities too. And this is what we do at ADL, right? And one more element that is more of a political, social element in Israel, but also the caring, the sensitivity towards the Israeli Arab population, being a minority here, being a minority that has also a different religion of the state's religion. What does it mean for them? For me as a Jew, I carry it as a responsibility, as a majority here, also as the responsibility of the majority, to wear these glasses of, we were the minority in an Arab country, and now you're the minority here, and we have the responsibility to make you feel at home exactly as we felt at home there. But today I also feel it is a role and a responsibility that I carry with me also to represent the ancient Jewish community in Morocco, to be the one continuing these beautiful traditions and to carry the story of the Moroccan Jewry to the next generation. And I hope we will not lose it. I see my kids also absorbing a lot of what I grew up on at home. And I feel it's very, very important, because the richness that we bring with other cultures to Israel is really such an important asset to the Israeli society. And I hope we start to appreciate the different cultures that are part of this beautiful Israel, and how this diversity enriches us and help us being who we are. As an Israeli, also the importance of social cohesion that we've been promoting at ADL for many years now, how on one hand, we do not forget the mistakes of the past, the mistakes of not, I would say, not ideal absorption in Israel, but at the same time, we fix it, not with a sense of victimhood, but with a sense of richness and appreciation and pride. And lastly, I would just mention that with the Abraham Accords, I think that, and the openness that Israelis got to the Arab world, first to the UAE, then to Bahrain, Morocco, I think that there's an understanding of, wait, we've missed this piece in Jewish history of Mizrahi Jewry. That is a very important chapter in this book of Jewish history, and we need to teach it, and actually there's a lot to learn from it. So the culture of moderation, the culture of conflict resolution, of togetherness, of bridging the gap. This is a narrative that we are starting to hear in Israel, and actually I'm very proud of it, and I myself try to promote it as much as I can.
George, before you go to Shadia, I'm so sorry. I just want to add one more point about this moment where we are. We can't ignore what happened in Israel on October 7th, and how that's impacted world Jewry, right? Our whole world has shifted. But maybe just to give you, again, another little lens onto how Mizrahi Jews, how Iranian Jews, and all Jews from the Arab world are feeling at this moment, which is unique. You know, I left Iran in 1978 through Israel and came to America. For 45 years, I hadn't thought about the Iranian Revolution. I hadn't thought that I had any trauma, because the story in our home was about one of freedom. My father and mother decided to come to America so we would never be afraid again. So we would be in a country that there is democracy, there is freedom of religion, there's respect for minorities. And that's what we grew up at home. My father was a huge American patriot, as am I. We love this country. We respect America for opening its arms and giving us that protection. October 7th changed that for all of us. All the, I would say, you know, generational trauma, we're all taught, this is a new word now we're all using, that we had in every cell of our body from generation after generation of fear and insecurity was brought up in all of us. I know Marjan feels it. I know we all feel that, oh my God, that safety and security we've been experiencing in America since the late 70s, early 80s, is now yet again like dusted off, and all the old fears are coming up. So that generational trauma that Mizrahi Jews have experienced is there, and it's come out again. And my daughter, who's 29, who's grown up here, born here, said, Mom, until then, all the stories you told me about life in Iran was an intellectual story. I understood it, but it was in my head. She said, on October 7th, for the first time in my life, I felt it. I felt it the way you do. And that was a very sad realization for me, George. I never wanted my children to feel what Jews around the world have felt for millennia. Lack of safety, lack of security. And so that trauma has come up for all of us. And I'm sure Marjan and Carol and others can affirm that. It's been a very difficult period just to see all those insecurities that we thought we had put away have come up again. I'm sorry, I just wanted to add that because I think it's very relevant for today.
And Sharon, let me just add one sentence on top of that. I mean, we should also consider that we live in a different world than Jews who stayed in the Arab world and are still there. There are still Jewish communities in the Arab world, much more smaller than the communities that we had 50 and 60 years ago, but they're still there. And when Israel is going into conflict in Gaza, we have to understand the impact on those communities, because they are perceived as automatically having relationships with Israel. Some of them do, some of them don't, but it doesn't really matter. For the regimes, for the governments, they are perceived as having relationships with Israel, and that's not a good thing for them. And again, they hide. They're not going to shul. They're not, their daily lives are disrupted. And we should remember that when we think about the Arab world, which was, to a certain level, I mean, in Morocco, it was a very positive experience. And at the same time, the Jewish Moroccan community today, as safe as they are, and they are generally speaking safe, these days are not easy for them.
Thank you for those additional points, Sharon and Carol. Well, it's important to understand the region as a whole. The Moroccan experience is unique, different from the Iranian experience. But I want to bring in Shadi to talk a little bit about the Syrian experience, which is both relevant historically and more recently when it comes to the trials and tribulations of both religious minorities in the Middle East and conflict in the region writ large. Shadi, your own story of being forced out of your home country, Syria, is unique and in many ways similar to the stories that both Carol and Sharon have shared. And Syria has also witnessed the mass expulsion of Jews over an extended period of time. Can you tell us a little bit about this story from your own personal perspective and the key themes that may be relevant to what both Sharon and Carol have shared?
Yes, thank you, George. Well, I'm going to give a perspective from the, let's say, Muslim Arab Syrian perspective, which is, this is my community. I was born into a family. Was my dad fought a war against Israel? He was an officer in the army, a very traditional Arabic Muslim family. For me, my generation, we didn't have any knowledge that there was Jews in Syria. My hometown is Aleppo, and actually I was always, when I first encountered Israelis and tell them Aleppo, they didn't recognize it. I had to say the term in Arabic, which is Halab or Halabi. So that's how they recognize it. So for me, my first encounter, I didn't know that there was a Jewish community indigenous to my city and my country until I was in 8th grade, when I met that there was 6 new transfer students coming to my school. And these kids were they were not talking to anyone. They were separate. They were huddling together. And I was like, who are they? Where did they come from? So I was talking around. Some people said, I don't know. Then one friend of mine came to me and just whispered, he said the word Yahud, which means Jews. And I was like, that was my first shock. We have Jews here? I've never known that. So when I went back home and I went to my mom said, do we have Jews? And she said, yeah, we have some, and that was it. There was no discussion after that. There was no one to tell me more than that, and it was like told to me not to ask more. And that was it. And in a month, these 6 kids just disappeared, and no one dared ask where they went. So fast forward until when I was displaced and was forced out of my country because of my government, and I started working in the field of humanitarian field, and I encountered some Jewish organization and Israeli organizations that some of them were descended of people who are from Syria and other Arab countries. That created some curiosity in me, like what happened? Where how much were there? How many? We didn't know. Like most of my generation, just this is a collective memory just wiped out. Israel was just these Europeans who went to Israel. There was no one from the regions, no one went there from the region. So it was just a curiosity that I started talking to people from my community and from the Jewish communities that were in the Middle East. One of my friends, and I reflected this in an article I wrote to Times of Israel, and I titled it, "They Never Said Goodbye," because my friend lived in a building in Aleppo that was mainly Muslim Jewish families. And his own mom was Jewish, but he converted to Islam when she married his father. But his neighbors were Jewish. And for him as a little kid, he just remembered playing with his neighbors that were Jewish. And one day he went and knocked on the door of his neighbor, and he didn't answer. And until now, and he's early 50s, he's bitter. He said he never said goodbye to me, like he left whenever. He didn't understand. 50 years old, living abroad, and he didn't understand what our Jewish community in Syria was subjected to. Why his neighbor had to leave all of a sudden under darkness with his family without telling him that he's leaving. All of this is total amnesia in a whole wide society in Syria and other Arab countries. And that's very important to acknowledge, because we as Arab communities, as Muslims, as Syrians, we have to recognize what happened. And we have to recognize we as a community have a fault in, because this Jewish community was indigenous to the land. They were not someone who just appeared somewhere. No, they were Syrians as much as I'm Syrians, and they actually spoke Arabic. You know, Hebrew was a language that was spoke maybe at home or maybe at religious, but they were Arabs. They were interlinked. They were talking to everyone in Arabic. We used to know them as our neighbors, as our doctors, as people we trusted with our lives. So that was a very important story to tell, because that's a story that is not being told in the Arab and the Muslim community. And it needs to be recognized. And I'm very happy that 30th of November now is the day to talk about the story and highlight the story, because it shouldn't be forgotten, and it should be an awakening to a lot of us.
You made so many important points there, Shadi. I just want to spend another few minutes talking about the important comment that you made about the historical role of Jews across the region. We all know on this call that Jews are an important part of the social fabric of the broader Middle East, of Iran, as Carol has pointed to, in North Africa, and as you've all identified, for not just centuries, but really for generations. I wonder if we could go around quickly, and if you all could reflect on how Jewish history and culture has been really integrated into these countries in many ways across the region, and how their absence or lack of inclusion has really changed the people, the society, and cultures in both the region or in a specific country. Sharon, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Carol and back to Shadi.
As I mentioned, you know, the Persian history has been very checkered vis-a-vis its minorities and its Jewish community. There were periods in Persian history where Jews were advisors to kings. And you can look at, especially within the realm of the arts and music, that the Jewish community was really the protector and the preserver of so much of Iranian culture while in Iran, and 1978 changed that. I saw a beautiful story of a video in one of the oldest music shops in Tehran. It was a very beautiful image of an old man, probably in his 80s, speaking, a Jewish Iranian, speaking about how the art of preserving classic Iranian instruments had been passed to him from generation to generation, and that his children had left, and there was no one left to teach them how to repair classic Persian musical instruments. So the fact that, at most, before 1978, the best numbers were about there were 100,000 Jews in Iran. Today, there's somewhere between, again, we don't have perfect numbers, 10, 12,000 Jews left. There is a void. There is a void left by not only the cultural norms, but the very fabric of Iran's society. I mean, what Shadi describes in terms of neighborhoods, again, I think there were periods of real integration, tolerance, and my parents' generation felt that. We lived in buildings of mixed Muslims and Jews. We went, many Iranian kids went to Jewish day school. I did, but there were many who went to public schools. So that void is there, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, a loss to all of the Middle Eastern countries whose Jewish communities have now essentially been ethnically cleansed. That's part of the frustration when we hear today about that language used against Israel. What happened to the Middle East was an ethnic cleansing of its Jewish population. You start with 1 million Jews across the Middle East around 1948. Today, at most, we have, 15, 20,000, maybe 30,000 Jews left throughout the Middle East and Iran. So, that is what happens to a whole region where they decide to get rid of one of these indigenous populations that have contributed in tremendous ways, poetry, literature, medicine, law, all of that. The Jewish community was there, and it's just no longer there. And I don't know about the future of Iran. You have countries now where there's no Jews left. In Egypt, I think you have 2 very elderly Jewish people left. Iran will probably become that. And that is really the saddest moment for these countries where ancient communities have just ceased to exist.
Carol and then Shadi?
I would say I represent the other side of the spectrum. The Jewish community in Morocco actually has a totally different story. It's interesting. Only when I was in Morocco in the last couple of months, I realized that Jews in Morocco called the Jewish quarter ghetto. They call it in Arabic the Mellah, but it's really a ghetto. That's how they related to it, and it's the only ghetto in Jewish history which is looked at in a positive way. They didn't go there just to isolate themselves because somebody isolated them, just because they wanted to live communal life, but there were a lot of Jews living out of this Mellah, of this ghetto. So the perception was not at all to be isolated from the general population. And actually, one of the things that we keep hearing from Moroccans today, even 40, 50, 60 years after Moroccan Jews, most of them left Morocco, is that they were angry. There was a film done, I can't remember the name, but the narrative is, how did you leave us? How did you Moroccan Jews leave Morocco, and you left us alone with such an important piece of the culture that you handled? You taught us, as Sharon said, musical instrument, doing the mosaic work that was a profession that Jews held, and literally taught the Muslims and the Berbers how to do it, and the leather industry and so on. The Jews were an inherent part of. So in Morocco, the perception of Jews is not only as an inherent part of the society, but as an important part of the society, as a very well respected part of the society, and as a part of the society that is missed until today. That does not mean that everything was perfect and is perfect even today, but the story, the narrative, what people remember is this beautiful and strong relationship that up until today is felt in Moroccan streets.
Thank you, Carol. Shadi, you noted how the existence of Jewish communities or Jewish families was scant even as a young person in Syria. Looking forward, how is the lack of inclusion of Jewish communities, culture, and heritage in Syria, how has that changed Syria, both historically and what does that mean for the future of Syria?
Well, in my opinion, it changed Syria a lot because the disappearance of one minority is an indication of intolerance, and it's actually affected other minorities in Syria. We saw the pressure goes into other minorities that are not from the big Muslim majority of Syria. It affected them all. So this intolerance that was the Jewish population was subjected to was also accepted for other communities, which have decreased tremendously. If we talk about the Christian community, for example, Syria had a much higher percentage of Christian community in it, but now it's much lower, and it's going lower every year. Now, for one of the things that Sharon highlighted is music. Music in Syria, and especially in Aleppo, the traditional music, which is called tarab, is actually, it came from Jewish prayers. When I went to the Sephardi synagogue, for instance, in Manhattan, and they were telling the prayers, it's just like I was listening traditional Syrian music, and I was like, what's going on here? Like, did you guys take it from our music? I said, no, it's the other way around, actually, and it was true, and it was all developed in Spain as part of the Muslim and the Jewish presence in Spain, and it came back to Aleppo and in Syria, and all of this enriched the culture. Every Syrian that you talk to and listens to this Arab, it's like his identity. It's like he's it's in an ecstasy when he listens to these songs, and it's all back goes to having Jewish influence in our society. So it has so much tremendous influence. Unfortunately, Syria is one of the cases that we have zero Jews at the moment. And it's not only that. The areas where you used to have more Jewish presence, I know two neighborhoods in my city that there was two synagogues, and usually it's around these synagogues. One of the synagogues is closed. It's behind these tall buildings that I didn't know about. Like, I've never known that there was a synagogue right there. The other one had all its windows like with bricks, because it was being these windows were being broken each and every time during these years after 1948. So we didn't know where they are. So it's all back from memories, and the memories were from some people very pleasant, but also not complete. We didn't have this complete memory and understanding of our Jewish community. It's this story needs to be told. We need to understand, as Syrians who are from Muslim and other communities, what we did, and we need to recognize this is part of the healing. When you tell people that were forced to leave your country, that you see their suffering, that's the first step to healing. And I think that's the first step to healing the whole Middle East, and part of the healing process also between Israel and Palestine. There is suffering. Sometimes I tell them we're all guilty of something in the Middle East, and at the same time we're all innocent in the Middle East. But the first step we need to do is recognize each other's suffering and what if each community did to the other, and then we can start talking and healing and reach some kind of understanding of how we can live together, how we can tolerate each other and not kill each other, like unfortunately is happening nowadays.
Thank you, Shadi. I think that recognition is such an important point about the history, about what happened, and it's an important part about setting the right themes for future generations to remember as well. In that regard, I want to use my last question, Carol, for you, if I may. When we think about this, we think about it in terms of generations. And recently, you had the opportunity to take your own parents back to Morocco for the first time. Can you kind of share with us a little bit about the trip? And in terms of a generational perspective, as yourself, a mother, how that trip with your parents, how that experience affected you, memories to share with your children, etc. Share the generational impact of that trip with us if you can.
Thank you, George, for this question. And I'm sorry if I'm going to be emotional a little bit, but it was like going back in time. It was the first time that we traveled, my siblings and I, with my parents alone. We all have families now, and we took time off of our families and left with our parents to a journey that, to me, changed my life forever. It's something to hear the stories, to be educated on, to learn, to absorb. This is one thing, but to experience it firsthand, to be there, to see where my father lived, where my mother lived, and seeing them being so emotional, going back to places they haven't seen for 50 and 60 years was really something, and see how all of the memories come back to them. Oh, here is where we lived, and here is the bakery and the school and the kindergarten, and here is where we used to go on Sundays to have coffee together, and so on. So that was very, very emotional. From a more sociological perspective, I can share that one thing that really impressed me and I take with me is the respect of the Moroccan government and the Moroccan society to religious institutions. Doesn't matter if they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whatever religions they represent. From a Jewish perspective, seeing how Muslims take care of religious institutions was so impressive and touching and moving for me. I heard from Muslims saying, this is a mitzvah, this is a religious order for us to take care of a cemetery, of a synagogue, because this is what we learned from our parents. The Jews are our brothers and sisters, and this is how we should treat the religious and communal institutions, with much respect, as much as we respect our religious institutions. And I have to say that seeing so many Moroccan Jews going to shul, to synagogue on Shabbat, to services with the Jewish clothing, the talit and kippot, and that was so impressive to me to see it in an Arab country. That I take those moments with me and I say, well, this is possible. But that, I think we shouldn't leave unanswered. How does that happen? And I think that the secret is in education. In a research that ADL has done some years ago, we have found that the textbooks in Morocco are probably the only textbooks in the Arab world that teach fully, completely about Jews in a positive way. And this is where it's all coming from. It comes all from education and from sense of partnership in this historic journey that Jews were part of, and we're not going to take them out of this journey, even if there's a conflict, even if there are disagreements. They're a part of this society, and this is a very, very strong element that you feel everywhere you go to in Morocco. Even more, even in areas that are less modern, even in areas that have less experiences with Jews, the notion that Jews were part of this society is very, very strong and very powerful. And aside from the history that I experienced, I think there's something about going alone with your parents to a place they lived in, and so many stories came, during the trips in the car that we've never heard. And for me, it completed a story. Like it puts a lot of pieces of the puzzle in the right place, that I was able to come and write so much about it, just for me to keep this memory alive, and for me to be able to tell my children. One thing I can say from a mother's perspective is that when children feel that they, not only that they are part of the story, that they have a role, that they have a place in the story, they act accordingly. They take this responsibility. They use the traditions. They ask questions. And I feel that this is very important for my Moroccan side, but no less important for my Israeli side, because this is the story of Israel. Having cultures from all around the world in this very small place in the Middle East come together and form this beautiful story of Israel.
That's touching. That's such a great way, if I may, Carol, to conclude on an uplifting thought in a time where I think most communities and most people tuning in today need something to look forward to and be positive about. So thank you for sharing that. I'd like to go ahead and conclude this recording today. And I'd like to thank Sharon and Shadi and Carol for sharing your stories, your own personal histories and insights with us. And thank you, Marjan, for helping introduce this topic and really setting the scene for why this is so relevant and timely today. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and please stay tuned on updates from the ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities and more thoughtful analysis from the team at ADL as well as the task force. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.